Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 49, the Battle of Salamanca. We have a special bonus episode we're doing today. We're going to kind of do a deep dive on the Battle of Salamanca with my good friend, Marcus Cribb. Marcus, how are you?
Good evening. How are you doing? Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. I know this is a bit out of structure for my usual episodes, but I thought it'd be an interesting way to go. And if it takes off and everyone loves it, we'll do more battles. If everyone hates it, I'll go back to, the bread and butter. But
Let's see what people think. Yeah, we've done
exactly.
a bit of
This would be
democracy
a good
recently.
one to touch, scratch the surface and see what everyone thinks. But we're going to cover the Battle of Salamanca from July 22nd, 1812. And what I like about this one, everyone says Waterloo is Wellington's masterpiece, and I disagree. I think he did a great job there, but he had a lot of help from Blucher and the Prussians. The Dutch, the Belgians were there as well. Don't you think Salamanca is more of his masterpiece?
Short answer, yes, I do. That's an easy one. Yeah, Waterloo, though it was Wellington's strategy, and I know we covered this in our previous, it was Wellington's strategy. He, of course, needed Blucher there, but he was also on the ridge, holding the ridge, kind of pulling Napoleon into a trap.
Yeah, and Waterloo was like a 10 to 12 hour slog. This one, what's the famous line? Wellington beat an army of 40,000 in 40 minutes.
That's roughly what they go with. The times don't quite go because it is a couple of week long campaign and a day long fight. But that key window of 40 minutes and throwing 40,000 men against roughly 40,000 men is about just under kind of 50,000 on each side. Makes it a far more dynamic battle, I think, far more interesting battle, and shows, for me, Wellington's actual abilities here rather than a static battle. You're kind of on the reactive. This is far more talking about what is possible, where there's opportunities, and we will dive into that. But this, I think, there's two potentials for Wellington's greatest victory, really, not Vittoria, not Porto, probably. So it's Salamanca or Assaye in India would be his kind of creme de la creme.
Agreed. Before we get into that, one quick shout out. If you'd like to learn more about Marcus or read some of his articles or blog posts or see what other podcasts he's been on, I recommend you go to dukeofwellington.org. And Marcus, that's your website, right? That you kind of maintain a lot of information on.
Yeah, it is. I set that up during the famous COVID lockdown as an output to all the thoughts going on in my head, and I need to update it more. We're talking about that, and I will curate a few more articles. Some are purposely out of date, like my article on Porto, because it clashes with my research of my book. But it's a fun one and does quite well, and it's that and Facebook, and I hang out a lot on Twitter because that's where some very lovely historian people do.
That's right. Yeah, dukeofwellington.org if you have a moment. But let's get into this. So we're kind of going to go with a linear structure of the battle, and the part that most people hate the most, and we'll try and speed through it, is the background leading up to it. But yeah, I think it's important to give a context leading up to the battle, don't you?
Yes, it is. So there's a few elements to this that we're following on from some of the great sieges, namely the siege of Badajoz in Spain. So Wellington's now captured what we call the gateways into Spain, which allows him to march from Portugal heading towards Madrid. And Salamanca is a major town on that route. And he's being shadowed, this town, with Marmont, and they're marching in parallel. And I don't know if you want to say a few words about Marmont, your opinion of him.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up for me. So around 1811, 1812, Napoleon's had enough of Marshal Massena. For whatever reason, he just, it's a very talented marshal, but I don't think his heart was in it. So he's replaced by Marmont, who is kind of he's definitely the youngest marshal. He's one of the up and coming, like, whiz kids of the marshalate. And, Napoleon's basically trained this guy since 1793 to become, he's already a really good artillery general, but I think Napoleon had a lot of faith in him to, come in, re-energize the French army, which he did, and give Wellington fits, which he also did initially. So I think Marmont did a good job up to July 22nd, 1812. But yeah, he was kind of Massena's replacement to lead the French army and to push the English back into Portugal.
Yes, I mean, Massena's downfall after Fuentes de Uno and his campaigns, and this is what I find so fascinating with the Peninsular War is Wellington comes across some fantastically skilled generals.
Yep.
And that doesn't necessarily mean actually I even think Wellington is more skilled than them, but he does defeat a long list of the who's who of the era, really.
Yep.
There's only a few who he doesn't come directly against, people like MacDonald and the Iron Marshal Davout, who don't come toe-to-toe with him, but many of the others he does.
So each side, though, they're about equally sized, don't you think? They're 45,000 roughly in troops.
Yeah, obviously there's always a wiggle room for some of this era because as soon as somebody nails down the exact number, actually you've got to take off some of the sick and wounded, and that's normally can be about 10% of the army. So both sides are just under 50,000, and kind of unusually they're very equally matched for this as well. Both Wellington's and Marmont's armies are very, very even. We say that Wellington's army's got Portuguese and Spanish, but actually the French army is from the Empire, so they're going to have a lot of the satellite states and auxiliaries in there as well.
Right, and I know already some Napoleonicists, Napoleon, I guess Bonapartists would say, oh, a lot of the frontline troops were in Russia. Marmont was dealing with second-line troops, but he had some very talented generals, Clausel, who went on to become a marshal. Foy, as we say in English, or General Foy, was a very good officer. So he had some good talent, Marmont did on his side. Yeah,
and Foy comes up quite a few times. He certainly becomes a quite skilled operator in this area. There is some quite substantial force and cavalry too.
Well, let's talk on the location a little bit. I know it's obviously Salamanca, central Spain, near Portugal. Have you been to this area? I know it's somewhat rolling hills, the landscape, right?
Yes, it is. I've been around this area. I've not actually got to Salamanca yet, for my shame, deep shame, but will do soon. It's rolling hills with some big flat areas, and that's perfect for this warfare that comes in. And for topography, for the battlefield itself that we will reach, there are two large features: the Greater and the Lesser Arapil. Which are the big hills that will dominate this fighting. And the lesser is slightly to the north, closer to Wellington's lines, and the greater to the south, slightly closer to Marmont's.
All right, so let's dive in. We get a little bit of a context there. And the weeks leading up to it, I think Marmont had done a good job. I think both armies were just basically trying to outmaneuver each other and outflank each other to get in a favorable position.
They were, and they shadow each other very closely for several weeks. And they move, they march during the day. And this is, July in Spain. This is difficult going for anyone in their woolen coats and leather shoes. Right. But neither finds at that moment. The only notable real event that happens for anecdotal purposes is just before the battle, there's a huge storm. And this certainly affects the Allied lines, where some of the horses break free in a lightning storm and they bolt and a few troopers get wounded. But actually, it starts to become part of the Wellington kind of legend that actually it becomes a good omen. Soldiers can be quite superstitious, maybe not as much as sailors, but it starts to come in, and it leads to a few parts of a pattern that we get where there's a storm and a heavy rain before Waterloo as well.
Yeah, and I was reading up on it. It seems that Wellington, he took a couple forts along the way, and I think he was trying to goad Marmont into attacking him, but Marmont didn't go for the bait.
Yeah, there's a ring of forts just outside Salamanca, where it's a very old historic city and near to the Portuguese border. And it's one of the things when you start to dive into, especially Portuguese history, is the amount of times that Portugal has been invaded by Spain, and even Britain sent some troops out there in the 1700s for the War of the Oranges between the two. So because Salamanca is near the border, it actually does have fortifications for it as well. So Wellington has to go and capture some of those.
Yeah, and I know Beresford is there as well. He's leading a Portuguese contingent. Duke of Wellington has some good soldiers under him at this time as well.
He does, and he's got a friend of his, Miguel de Alava. And what I love about Alava is he was previously in the Spanish Navy, so he's already witnessed Trafalgar, but from the Spanish and French side, fighting against the British. And he will go on to become one of Wellington's closest friends, who he gets given a cottage on their estate. He stays with him for some time. Their families kind of come over due to the liberal revolution after the war, and Wellington actually gives him access to his bank account. So the two become very much brothers in arms. And he's leading the Spanish contingent, which are actually off the main battlefield, so they don't take large part of the fighting. But I always like to mention Alava when he appears in history books.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's jump into the battle. What happens in the morning of July 22nd?
So the two armies, we said about 50,000 men, they're marching in parallel, and it's nothing unusual. They've been doing it for a few weeks now. At certain times, they've been getting about 2 kilometers apart, so well within cannon shot.
Right.
And they're getting onto the plains around the south and southeast of Salamanca. Off in the distance, Wellington's got the 7th Division and the 3rd Division, and they are under Edward Pakenham, which is Wellington's brother-in-law, who's married to Kitty Pakenham.
He unfortunately dies later in 1815, but
he dies at New Orleans, leading the attack. Not his finest moment either, but he was also one of Wellington's inner circle, and I think one of his true friends in life. So it's very sad when I read about New Orleans. They're marching forwards. They're going round. There's some light fighting to try to capture each other off these arapils. So they noticed very quickly that these areas are going to dominate the terrain.
It's like a ridge, right? It's like a ridge almost.
Yeah, the lesser is kind of quite a low rolling feature. Quite good. And then the greater is it's longer, it's more ridge-like, and it has a quite a sharp piece of rock that kind of goes along a bit of an L shape to it, which is actually facing north towards the Allied lines, creates quite a defensive position for the French to get into. So they start to kind of skirmish troops out. Some of the Portuguese get onto the lesser, and the French dominate this greater. But both continue to march. Now we're kind of going northeast to southwest, kind of diagonally across this plain. It's about this time that things start to get drawn out. So Ned Pakenham's off. We've got the 3rd Division off to the far left, the 7th Division to the middle left, and then a lot of the Allied troops. Sorry, this is British Allied, 6th, 4th, 1st, and in the cluster. And then actually almost at the tail of Wellington's column is the Light Division. Okay.
Let's briefly talk about formations, because maybe someone who's not familiar with army marching, like you don't want to be too thin, but you also don't want to be too compact where you're an easy target for cannons, right? So you want to, if you're too thin, you leave yourself open to an attack that'll slice your army in half, correct?
So they're going to be marching kind of regimental columns, both sides. We talk often about columns for the French attacking, but it's how the British and Allied would march as well. So it'll tend to be thicker, about 4 men wide, marching, and then have the senior NCOs like the sergeants and sergeant majors and the officers to the side, and the officers tend to be front and back, either on horses or on foot. Many of them on horses, with the colours either at the centre or right in the middle to be protected, depending on the formation.
Okay.
So both armies are going to be quite long and thin here, and ready to react. So if the British were going to react, they would then turn and start to spread out into 2 deep. Whereas the French would have to maneuver around or turn and start to move into attacking columns. But that was quite standard for both, because you don't want to be, for example, British fighting 2 deep column or 2 deep line. Sorry, they wouldn't want to be marching in 2 deep, because that's going to double their distance for marching. And then it's a bit like a caterpillar effect if something goes wrong, from experience with the army. One person trips, stumbles, falls into a river, and that starts to slow down, speed up. A bit like a bad rush hour traffic, I suppose. If somebody slams their brakes on, the effect behind it could be quite great.
Right. That's like a peloton in the Tour de France. Like when one biker goes down, they all go down. Yeah.
Yes, that's a good analogy. And they will clash into each other like that.
Yeah. So it's morning. You know, like you said, the French are kind of getting too thin in areas. Like the leading division gets separated from the follow-up, the second division that's part of Marmont's group. And then Marmont notices, he mistakenly believes that the British are going to retreat. Does he just see like a cloud of dust in the distance? What does he see there?
Yeah, he does. He sees the dust, and this dust is heading towards Salamanca, and he thinks it's Wellington pushing his baggage train, his supplies, his camp followers, his logistics back towards Salamanca, and then Wellington would move into the city.
Because that's what you would do if you're about to retreat. You push
get them out first because they're slow moving, lots of wagons, larger elements, and literal camp followers. So you've got things like forges and supplies, but also the wives and sweethearts.
Right.
It's not Wellington's baggage train. It's the 3rd Division under Ned Pakenham taking a wide circle down off to the west. So they start to go for it. Marmont starts to order his men to kind of go west and start to push towards that. If he was right of his assessment, it would have been a good move. He would have got between Wellington and his baggage.
Right.
But it's not going away. It's coming forward.
But even Wellington, though, I think I mean, obviously he has a plan in mind, but he sits for lunch, right? He doesn't think that the French are going to fall for it.
No, he's not. It's not a planned deception. It's his 3rd Division that's been out purposely flanking, but he's not trying to do it to draw up. It's not one of these tactics that they're all dressed up in something and it's a ruse de guerre.
Right.
And he does stop. There's 2 versions of this event, and it becomes one of my favourite anecdotes either way of the entire Peninsular War. He's either stood in an orchard with his headquarters. Now, Wellington's headquarters, worthy of note, is very loose. It's lots of officers, and especially junior officers, who he works as aide-de-camp outriders, rather than Napoleon's headquarters, for example, being set tents and heads of department. Right. Wellington's more of a micromanager, really. And it's very different. If you looked at, just as a side point, if you looked at Napoleon's headquarters, you'd recognize kind of a NATO format today. Wellington micromanaging, he's running the battle. So he's either stood in this orchard having lunch, or he's on horseback packing, and he did have packed lunch effectively in his saddlebags, on the back of the horses. Yep. And we know he ate things like boiled eggs or cheese and cold meats and bread. So he's kind of picnicking. But on his horse, observing the armies marching, because they're both marching, and there's very little going to happen probably. And as he starts to see the French move, now they kind of been given the order to kind of let leash by Marmont. Let me just check my pronunciation. Thombriers and Macoun.
Yep.
Is that close enough?
Yeah, the first 2 divisional generals. That's right.
The first 2 divisional generals. They start to push off towards the 3rd Division, who they think are going away, but they're coming in. Wellington sees this, and lightning bolt of energy. This is why I like Wellington. He's not this laconic kind of defensive general. He sees this. He throws his lunch over his shoulder. The story goes, it's a chicken leg, cold meat, and he says, "By God, that will do." Now he either jumps onto his horse, or he's already on it, and he races off towards the 3rd Division, low flat plain, on his horse. And he's a very good horse rider. He's quite good at languages, but he's a very good horse rider. He gets over to the 3rd Division. He doesn't actually speak to Ned Pakenham directly, as far as I'm aware, but he meets the brigade commanders, starts going, "Get your men going. You are going on the attack. Get those spurs in. Get your boots on.
Right.
Move." Apparently, he gives this order, and he starts racing back towards his centre to get them going forwards. And he actually passes his aide-de-camp, who are trying to catch him up, as he's already given the orders and turned around. That's how well he's riding.
Right.
And he goes into the centre and starts to push forward the middle of his line, the 5th, the 4th, and then the 7th Division, into an attack. And this 3rd Division come wheeling round.
Right. And I can only imagine Marmont's horror once he realizes what's about to happen, because his army's going to get severed basically in 2.
Yeah, and it's like almost near the head of the column. So he's lost about a third of his strength. Kind of his gun about to be severed down the middle, and they're strung out. Now you don't want to recall them because then that starts to cause panic.
Right.
So they've got to kind of stand there and take it.
Yeah. And Marmont, credit to him, he realizes what's happening. He hops on his horse and he's about to, issue counter orders to fix this problem. But what happens?
Marmont's, he's realizing third division is coming in, and he's stood on the ridge, and a British bit of shrapnel, more than likely. We've talked about before. It's got musket balls within, so it's a very effective area weapon, as the French have just got kind of the case itself, and that hits him into his ribs. So he's out. So it goes over to his second command, General Bonnet, who's also wounded, I believe in the leg, actually, very soon afterwards. So you've lost the commander. That's very unfortunate. You lose the second in command as well. Well, actually, you've kind of then got a leadless situation for a moment.
Yeah, I think it's like 30 minutes. There was no commander until Clausel takes over. But and he does, credit to him, Clausel becomes a marshal later in life. He's a very smart general. But I mean, the moment is lost. I mean, Clausel does issue a counterattack, which I don't want people to think the British didn't take a lot of casualties. They did. And the counterattack almost worked, but I think it was just too little too late.
Yeah, and Clausel, real credit to him. He's a divisional commander and he has to now step up to be the army commander. And they get that counterattack as the British and the Portuguese are coming on in the center. The French, who are kind of their center right, start to push in and counterattack them. And there's some really fierce infantry fighting. The next stage that happens, though, is the third division are coming on, is General Cotton, who's the commander of the Allied cavalry. He's near the Allied cavalry are between Wellington Centre and the third division. So they link in, and he unleashes a chap called Jean Le Marchand with his heavy cavalry, which are dragoons and dragoon guards. Now, John Le Marchand, worthy of note, sounds very French-sounding name. He's from the Channel Islands, so he's got a French-sounding name, but he's in the British Army. And he's written, literally, the book on cavalry. So he did two things. He witnessed the British cavalry operating in what was then the Low Countries, the Netherlands, who were awful, basically, at the time. They were chopping off their own horses' ears, and when the swords hit, the swords were breaking. And this was due to the system where the men were trained independently. So he reformed a way to write the cavalry drills, and they learned the cuts. And he also designed two types of swords: the 1796 light cavalry saber, which is slightly weighted at one end and will go through all the way to the bone, and the 1796 heavy cavalry sword, which famously that's the one that Sharp carries in the Bernard Cornwell series. But it's really too heavy for dismounted fighting, and they both are. They are very different weapons. The sword being straight and the saber being curved, very effective weapons, and warranted never to fail. So they were warranted never to break. So it's a real step up. And it's Le Marchand who goes in, and they absolutely smash through the French first line and the French second line of column of march as they're turning to face. So they don't get into square. And there's a small patch of woods behind the French, those two lines. They get into there, and they have to then turn around because the woods are bad for cavalry to get amongst. And actually, sadly, Le Marchand is shot out the saddle and killed.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah, he was a very talented officer for the British.
He hadn't had as much kind of field command as maybe he should have, but cut down too early when his reforms had real widespread effect. Whenever we talk about British cavalry, Le Marchand's kind of stamps all over them.
And I mean, the French are just reeling here. I know one divisional general, I think it's Ferret, he gets killed as well. Actually, I think two of them do, because it's such a surprise that they were overwhelmed like they were. Yeah.
And that's just adding to this level of confusion. And there's further attacks coming in from the British and Portuguese all over.
Yeah.
And it's about this point where Ferret's coming in, and he's being ordered by Clausel to hold them off. And he holds them off in a line on the hillside. And as the Portuguese come in, I mentioned earlier, that ridge, the Portuguese can't get up the steep rocky outcrop of this ridge, and the French are able to pour volley in almost point blank into them, causing quite heavy casualties. So certainly don't think at any point that the French aren't trying to give as good as they get, but what's happening is that they've got cavalry hammering in on the French, and then you've got the 3rd Division sweeping round as well.
Yeah, and I know the Lean Division General Tomiez, he's killed as well. So it's not going well for the French. It's pretty bad.
No, it really isn't, and that's unusual. I don't think they expect to kind of be on that back foot that early. So those levels going, really in the center and on the left is causing a lot of pressure onto them.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we're basically, there's only one thing that Clausel can do, which is retreat. I think Foy's division was the only one that was not initially affected by he was like in reserve, so he had to kind of cover the retreat.
Yeah, he's starting to pull back and has to cover that. Meanwhile, in the Allied center, there's some significant events of almost like hand-to-hand fighting going on with the infantry. Mm-hmm. And two events of note: the 44th Regiment and capture their first eagle. They go forward, and the story goes that Lieutenant Pierce, along with some privates, Finley, Murray, Blackburn, and Devine, and also a officer of the 4th Regiment, Maguire, and the Pratt of the 30th, surprise a group of French soldiers. And as they do so, I believe it's the 62nd Regiment of the line, they try to hide it. The French officer tries to hide it under his greatcoat. French often fought in greatcoats.
Yeah, let's talk about these eagles, because obviously Napoleon and his armies have smashed and captured many flags and banners from opposing armies, but eagles were very, very difficult to get. Why was that?
Well, they were the height of the regiment's honor, and they epitomize the spirit, the elan, the coup of this regiment. And actually, there'd been a reform by this point. So it used to be that each regiment had one at the headquarters, and by this point, Napoleon started to reform them. It only the 1st Battalion of each regiment took them as well. Mm-hmm. The regimental eagles had actually been given out by Napoleon himself. In Paris, and so there was a real element here, and we talk often about the cult of Napoleon, and his men were big believers in this. You would be, really, frankly. Yeah. And they believe it's been touched by the Emperor's own hands, and certainly some of his men held him in like a demigod status. And
right, I was gonna say, like, that's been touched by a god in their mind.
Yes, yeah, and we were both very interestingly on a podcast with Lafayette podcast recently, and we talked about the legacy of Napoleon and the way he's remembered in certain ways, positive, negative, but certainly his men would behold that, and this isn't 100% unique to the Eagles. A regiment's honor is tied up in their colours, the flags, sure. And they would fight. And this isn't a unique case. Men would fight to the absolute death. To hold this eagle. Albuquerque, a lieutenant, lost his arm holding on to a colour and carried on fighting. Mm-hmm. That's the level. They put the lives of their colours, their eagles, beyond their own.
Yeah, and that just shows, like, when a regiment's lost its eagle, then it must have been really decimated by. Because usually that's in the center of the regiment.
That's it. It's in the center. It's in the middle. It's being specially protected by. It's being carried by officers, but it's being protected by NCOs, and it's got the honor of the entire regiment. So if it starts to get into a bit of a melee, men are going to start moving towards that. They're literally the rallying point of the regiment. Right. So this is where we get the 30th of the British capturing the 22nd Regiment Eagle, and the 44th Regiment capturing the 62nd Regiment Eagle. The slightly different circumstances. The 62nd try to hide theirs under a jacket, and the 22nd, there's a short bit of fight where the private tries to level his musket towards the British Ensign Pratt, and he gets shot carrying on. Both these eagles go back to Britain. Mm-hmm. now, only the eagles really that go back to Britain survive counter-revolutions. There's a rumoured third eagle, and they write about a third eagle being captured. It never appears, but what is captured by the 88th Connaught Rangers, nicknamed the Devil's Own, these are often Gaelic-speaking Irishmen, famously some of the hardest to control and some of the hardest fighters, is they captured Jingling Johnny, which is, if you've seen it, the Ottoman kind of paraded staff with all the bells on it.
Yeah, like almost like a banner with bells and with
yeah. It's like got layers of bells all over it, semi-crescent design, like hundreds of bells, and it makes this quite rhythmical sound. It has a little handle that turns on it.
Right.
And what the story goes that there's pictures of it with a small eagle on top. Now, was that a full regimental eagle? Was it not? There is a lot of debate about this, but one version, and I tend to slightly hedge my bet so that this is probably what happened, is it being adopted as the regimental eagle, and that it was taken, and the soldiers who would normally, let's face it, were being paid in arrears, e.g., kind of in debt there.
Yep.
Because it looks gold, they're not. They're wooden with gold leaf or gold paint. They're actually, the eagles thought it's going to be solid gold, or at least gold and hollow. So they rip it apart. Take a wing here and a beak there, and we can buy some gin in good British fighting fashion and spend it on liquor. It doesn't ever appear, but Wellington does write that there's 3 eagles captured and only 2 are kind of sent back to him. So it's quite probable that a third was taken.
One more controversy I read about, and this has to do with the escape of the French. That and I don't know how legitimate this is, because if this was a kind of something that Wellington hadn't expected to do this day, but it says the Spanish were supposed to take control of a bridge that the French could. There was only one bridge out of this trap, and for whatever reason, the Spanish had withdrawn from this bridge without informing Wellington.
Yes.
But do you know about that? Yeah.
So basically, at the Alba de Tormes, the Spanish are meant to guard that route, and there might have been just a misunderstanding in orders. It might have been a more local thing. It could have been, slight ineptitude, but it doesn't get hold by the Spanish. There seems to be a lot of confusion as to why the Spanish didn't hold it, but it does allow the French to get away. So the French start to do a very effective rear guard here. And that, especially under Foy and Clausel now, Foy kind of comes in and they hold this rear guard. The British Light Division kind of start to come up. At this point, I find it quite ironic, because this is the regimental honour day of the Rifles, which are part of the Light Division. Actually, they've got so many great battles to choose from. This is probably the one that they're least engaged with. They're off on the right flank. But they start to come in, and there's a very effective French rear guard. So that allows what was, Marmont's troops, Clausel's troops, to actually get away. That we will speak about it many times with Wellington, but he's often frustrated. That moment of victory, where he should then wrap in and loads of people come in and they start to throw down their arms and surrender, and he can have his real triumphant moment, kind of rightly so, which would arguably shorten the war. He doesn't get, time and time again, he doesn't get it after Salamanca.
And he doesn't get it at Vittoria either. Yeah,
he doesn't get it at Vittoria. He doesn't actually really get it after Waterloo. He doesn't get it. He doesn't get it in most battles. But Vittoria is the other one that really comes to mind, that he gets really frustrated that he's not able to get there.
Well, in fairness, the one time he did get it at Vimeiro, that one didn't end well either. So yeah.
No. So he just doesn't have that. He doesn't have that luck at all.
Yeah.
And what does happen is the next day, they do start to catch up with the French rear guard just a little bit further off, outside Garcia Hernandez. Not sure if you've read about this one.
I have, yeah. They broke some squares.
They break some squares. Yeah, that's why I get quite excited about this one. So they catch up with Foy's rear guard,
right? And
the French cavalry come out, but that means that actually some of the French line troops are kind of left a bit exposed to the King's German Legion, the KGL. And these are the typically Hanoverian soldiers fighting for the Elector of Hanover, who also is George III, King of England.
Correct.
So these are brave Germans whose homeland is occupied by the French forces. So they've got a real motivation here to get their own back at the French. And they fight here as heavy cavalry. They go in against the 76th French Regiment, who form squares. So that's this is rock, paper, scissors of Napoleonic warfare. So the French will swing their sides back and then form a four-sided obstacle. And the cavalry shouldn't be able to get into that. It's going to be a strong rock. The sharp scissors should come in, like the kids' game, and they should be blunted and peel off like waves crashing around a rock in the ocean.
Right.
But they're very vulnerable if you can get in. And this is actually luck. Now, the cavalry are charging directly at the squares. That's brave. But one of the horses is killed just as it would normally turn away. Now, horses are quite smart animals, and they don't want to charge into a row of bayonets. But as the horse is killed, he no longer has that choice, and it smashes through, knocking French soldiers flying. The KGL jump in behind, and that means what's facing the guys who jump in is the backs of the Frenchmen who are forming square. They start to cut their way in. That means then the soldiers who are then at the front are being attacked from behind and can do nothing about it.
Right.
And that causes the square to break.
Yeah.
Dramatic moment.
Yeah, and that must be very demoralizing for the other squares.
Very demoralizing. They're seeing their friends, colleagues being cut down kind of by a freak accident with an element of bravery in there, and they're starting to go. That square they form square as well because there's cavalry around, you would, and that square starts to run towards them, the survivors towards the second squares. Right. Now, they need to keep that solid formation and keep their friends out, but they're not going to open fire on their friends. As they're letting their friends into the square, they're not going to be joining their ranks and swelling the square up. They're just kind of making it quite a loose formation.
Yeah.
And the KGL take the opportunity and they jump in and get within that square as well. And that causes that to break as well.
What a nightmare. Yeah. That's a bad 2 day. Basically, just a bad campaign right there.
It is, and it's kind of part of the battle. It's the real follow. It's the rear guard action. But I always think it's worthy of note because it's quite unusual for squares to be broken. It happens really a handful of times in the entire era. And to break 2 squares the day after Salamanca is, quite an action. And it's partially luck and partially bravery for the King's German Legion, but it's got that unusual element and allows us to explain how Napoleonic warfare really is a rock, paper, scissors of cavalry, infantry, and the artillery as well.
Okay. Well, let's talk casualties. And casualties are always difficult to explain. First, this was 200 years ago, so it's hard to get accurate numbers.
Right.
So on the British side, or the Allied side, they had, 5,000, maybe 5,200 killed, wounded, or captured. On the French side, 12 to 17,000 killed, wounded, or captured. I think people get mistaken that means 17,000 were killed, but it doesn't mean that. It just means that basically 12 to 17,000 troops are going to be unavailable for the next campaign. They're either captured, maybe they're slightly wounded, maybe they're scarred for life. It's such a vague thing.
Yes. Yeah, it's a really broad spectrum. Wounded could be, a musket ball across the flesh, or it could have been lost a leg. But it's roughly half, roughly 7,000 and 7,000 between killed and wounded, and 7,000 prisoners captured by the British. So those are obviously out. If they're captured, there will be a few escapes. There will also be some officers are paroled, and there are prisoner exchanges later on. But many are taken back to Britain. They end up in decommissioned ships in places like Portsmouth Harbour, a city I used to live in, and they end up in these prison hulks, or actually into places like Portchester Castle that convert into prison camps. And they're sometimes given to manual labour or allowed to do small trading actions. They do scrimshaw, they do little carvings. But they tend to be back, and then officers tend to be exchanged. So 14,000 kind of either immediately out of the action or temporarily out.
But still,
quite a large number.
Out of 45,000, that's a large amount.
Yeah, I think it's a significant number, really, for the French. That is going to have a huge effect on their operational ability, but also the other men survivors' morale as well, proportionally.
Well, there's 2 more things I want to bring up. One, General Foy wrote in his diary a few days after the battle, quote, This battle is the most cleverly fought, the largest in scale, the most important in results of any that the English have won in recent times. It brings up Lord Wellington's reputation almost to the level of that of Marlborough. Up to this day, we knew his prudence, his eye for choosing good positions, and the skill which he used them. But at Salamanca, he has shown himself a great and able master of maneuvering. He kept his dispositions hidden nearly the whole day. He allowed us to develop our movement before he pronounced his own. He played a close game. He utilized the oblique order in the style of Frederick the Great, end quote. I mean, you can't get a better compliment from an opposing general.
No, and I don't like to compare, apples with oranges, but he does get there compared to Marlborough and Frederick the Great, and it's very hard to compare, generals because they fought different wars in different eras. But that's certainly high praise from one's enemy, and I think it's nice to actually have respectful comments on both sides. Wellington respected Napoleon, so that's a nice way to kind of pay tribute to him. As well as obviously, I always like to pay tribute to the men under their command who have to get on the sharp end of things.
Right. And the second thing I wanted to mention, which I think is just typically Napoleon, I'm sure this is the last thing he wanted to hear, but right before, now, Salamanca and Moscow are very far apart. So just keep that in mind. But right before the September Battle of Borodino, which was probably the grisliest, most grotesque, violent battle of all the battles other than Leipzig, Napoleon has handed a note that Marmont has lost at Salamanca. So I can only imagine Napoleon's reaction when he got that note right before the Borodino battle.
Was that the one where he did fly into a rage, or was that another
I don't think
one?
he flew into a rage, but I'm sure it didn't please him to get that note right before he's about to fight a giant battle.
No, I can't imagine it put him into a good mindset at the very least, because he's now realised that he is effectively on the other side of Europe, and his back door to France is looking quite wide, and it does eventually get marched all the way through the Pyrenees in, and Salamanca starts to solidify. It's often known as the year of victory. We've had Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo, and Salamanca is this big set piece battle where the Allies get in amongst the French. There's a lot of these warfare are maneuver. We see that for weeks before Salamanca, but when it gets in, it's brutal fighting. There's a huge element of hand-to-hand, both cavalry and infantry, and musket volleys as well. There's a huge mix of that, and it causes high levels of casualties on both sides. The French, you'll probably want to say, but they lose some divisional commanders, and the British they lose Le Marchand, who's their only senior officer, killed, but they have some light casualties. Cotton, who I mentioned, the cavalry commander, even Beresford, the marshal of the Portuguese forces, he's wounded, and people like Van Alten as well.
Right. Now, it's not the tipping point for the French. They don't get ejected until really after the Battle of Vittoria. But what do you think the legacy of this battle is?
I think Salamanca is the one for Wellington's reputation. For the long term, it shows him as his we call it his master strike. It shows that he can work as an opportunist and can get in on the offensive when needs be without a planned offensive. Remember, both sides thought this was going to be another day's marching after weeks. This was not going to be the day of a set piece battle. And so long term, this is fantastic for Wellington's reputation. It's the one to look at if you want to see, why Wellington's not a defensive general, for argument's sake, but Vittoria certainly up there as well. Mm-hmm. But Salamanca starts to prove that this is also, for the campaign, going to be that they can beat the French again in set piece battles. They've had quite a few victories, but it's starting to bring together a lot of elements, especially within Spain, which is where the war is going to go. Before that, we've been very close to the border, and we need to get into Madrid, and that's now the next stage.
Right. Yeah, it's just, if Wellington was like handing in his CV or his resume, I think this battle will be at the very top.
Yeah, personally, for me, you'd go Salamanca, Assay, actually quite a few before Waterloo, actually, sorry to say it, and only Assay down because the numbers, though they look like they're about 10 to 20 to 1, they're very hard to call, and the Indian army, as the kind of the Maharata army, were actually very good quality, but it's a planned action for most of it, and it's certainly probably actually a harder fight. Salamanca, I think, for Wellington's reputation, is this opportunist moment, and fighting Marmont, fighting Clausel, Foy, Ferrere, they have a very good reputation within the European circles as well. So I think that's just tips it a little bit, and there'll be some Assay lovers out there. Wellington himself, when he was asked later of his greatest victory, he said Assay. So I could be wrong too, but I think Salamanca for me is the one that I'd hold up as going, oh, hold on a second, this is really something quite different.
Right.
And General Foy's saying it, so who am I to argue?
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be learned. Like if you studied that in a military college, I think it's a very interesting battle to analyze.
Yeah, definitely. And there's not as big a legacy as places like Waterloo, but there are some places named after it. Those 2 eagles are captured, are on display at more local museums actually. But it's certainly it's also actually very well known within the in Spain. Some regimental honors. Now the irony is the Spanish barely fight into the battle at all. That's why I haven't mentioned them. They suffer 6 casualties. 6. One more than 5. But I'm not saying that's how low I'm saying. It's incredibly little maneuver, but actually where it's around Spanish town, their army is attached. They hold it actually as well today.
Yeah, no, it's just a fascinating battle, and I appreciate you giving us the insight on it. And really, really interesting. If my listeners would like to learn more about it, I recommend diving in and reading up on it, and maybe going to dukeofwellington.org.
Yeah, I've got a little bit on it, and I always welcome that. I know there's a fantastic video on Epic History TV that's got a really good video. But it's in Sharp Sword if you're onto that book. There's quite a few good battlefield guides, and I don't like to choose favourite within authors, but there's a good Osprey. There's a good bit in Roy Muir. So there's quite a lot you can pick up on a Salamanca, and it's certainly one I'd encourage you to do so.
All right. Well, thank you all, as always, my friend. That was an excellent addition, and I appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. And like I was saying before, if your listeners enjoy this, let us know, because we might do some more.
Yeah, I'd love to. This was great. Thanks so much, Marcus.